Do you think that young men are indeed falling behind in terms of, we hear this all the time, that they're falling behind their age-matched peers that are women in terms of just sort of life progression?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think there's no question of that. So I forget if it was 41% of college graduates are men now. So I think like it's really lopsided. I think in 1975, the average age of marriage for a man was 23.8, and now it's 30.8. It's not average, median. So half of the people are actually older than that. For women, it was 21.1 to 28.4.
People will make financial arguments around that. I see that a lot. People will say, well, it's very expensive to be able to raise a family, et cetera. That's often what you hear, at least in California. People will say that they're waiting because they need to establish a certain level of income. Is that true?
Sure. I think that's what people are subjectively feeling. 50% of people adults under the age of 30 live with their parents now. I forget what the statistic used to be like 20 years ago. So we are absolutely seeing like economic difficulties. So everything is slowing down, right? But I think that the biggest difference is, as a society, men are the one group of people that we expect to help themselves. So if you look at and there's I'm not saying women don't deserve help. So there's some examples of this that I think are not great. So there are homeless shelters for every gender, and then there are homeless shelters for women. There are no male-only homeless shelters. I think that's a good example of you don't need a male-only homeless shelter, because that's an example of like women who are in all gender homeless shelters are really way more unsafe than if they're on their own. So like that's an example of like, I don't think everything should be equal between all genders. But I think the challenge is that, if you just talk to men, or if you talk about men, there are many things that will say, okay, like the patriarchy is harmful to both men and women. Fair enough. But like, what are we going to do societally, systemically, to support the men who are struggling? So there aren't, even though only 41% of people who graduate from college are men, the number of male-only scholarships is like really small. So as a society, it's really interesting. I think we're not really supporting men in the way that we need to. Now, a lot of people will hear this as, oh, it is my responsibility as a woman to do things for my husband or boyfriend or whatever. I don't think it's like women's responsibility. I think that's a big problem historically, that women have been responsible for certain aspects of men. I think the work that I do and the work you do, the work we do, is to try to help men, women, and everybody else take care of themselves. But I do think there's plenty of data that suggests that men are falling behind. If you look at rates of addiction, deaths of despair, this is a really interesting scientific measure that came a lot out of the UK. These are basically deaths that relate to suicide. Male suicide rates are 4 times what they are for women. So it's interesting. Like now, hopefully this is changing. But when I was in residency, we had women's mental health clinics. We didn't have male mental health clinics.
Do men in relationships, are they protected from some of the negative effects that you're describing?
This is fascinating. So do you know what Takotsubo cardiomyopathy is? Have you heard of this?
Is this when people die of a broken heart?
Yeah. So this is what's really fascinating. People don't realize this, but women are far more likely to initiate divorce. So I think the interesting statistic about this is you can look at gay couples. So gay men who get married have less than a 50% divorce rate. I think they get divorced maybe 30% of the time. Lesbian couples have the highest divorce rate. So they get divorced, I think, something like 60% of the time. So it's even greater than 50%. So I did a lot of work on this because I've had so many patients who, when they go through a breakup, like it really ruins their life. And there's research on this, okay? I'm not like misogynist or anything like that. So if you look at qualitative research, if you ask a woman after she goes through a divorce, what did you lose? She will say, I lost a relationship. If you ask a man, what did you lose? They say, I lost a life. So it's just different. So women will oftentimes form many connections. So when they lose their relationship, they lose a relationship. But men are by some amount of biology, by some amount of conditioning, by some amount of culture, oftentimes will have one emotional support in their life, which is their wife. And I've worked with plenty of women for whom this is overwhelming because they become their husband's therapist because their husband doesn't know how to manage their own emotions. That's not good. That's not healthy. But if we're looking at outcomes, the cortisol spike that men get after divorce is way higher. The amount of inflammation that they experience is way higher. I think they have an acute risk of heart attack that elevates. So some of this is probably biology. We're just wired differently. Like this is also another thing that's really interesting. The inflammatory response from a cold is greater in men than it is in women. So like when my wife gets sick, she's able to do stuff, but like my inflammatory response is actually like I'm out. And there's a lot of physiological evidence for why that is. And it may have something to do with if you sort of look at like in the animal kingdom, a male lion is much more likely to fight by baboons, much more likely to get scratches and things like that. So we need a more robust immune system. So we want a stronger immune response. But yeah, Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, I mean, the mortality risk of divorce for a man is way higher than a woman.
It's interesting because, and these are individual cases, but not population studies, but I've had a lot of young men and their parents reach out to me. Like my kid is really struggling. He's really languishing and he's really falling behind. He's got these issues, that issues. There are all these like loose correlations that I'll just throw out there. I often hear, and I'm not saying this is the cause, but I'll hear, oh yeah, and even their moms will know sometimes. They'll say, he's had some like really serious sexual side effects. He was using these anti-hair loss meds. I wonder, is it that? They always want to find like what's the one thing that can put them back on track. And I'm not a psychiatrist, so I've talked to them before, and oftentimes we'll get a sense of what's going on more generally. And I actually have noticed that a number of these guys have relationships. They're very close with their girlfriend. They have very kind, loving, supportive girlfriends. And the girlfriends are doing well in life. They're moving forward professionally, but the guy isn't. He's sort of stuck. And that was a surprise to me. I thought they would be totally alone. They'd have no access to dating or mates. No, that's not what's happening in many cases. They're sort of just stuck. They can't seem to find a profession. They can't seem to get ahead. And they've got these very kind, very, very patient girlfriends that are sitting it out with them for I don't know how long. I don't know if they'll stick around, but that seems more and more common. So they can find the relationship, but they can't seem to launch into being a grown man, frankly.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, that was me. So, it took me 5.5 years to graduate from college. I graduated with a 2.4 GPA. And then I started med school at 28. I couldn't support myself financially until I started residency at the age of 32. My wife started working at 16 and has never stopped. And so there was a period of like 5 years where like, what was I doing? I had a research assistant position at Harvard, but I was basically applying to medical school. And so like I was going nowhere real fast, and she stuck it out with me, which is quite amazing. Like I'm still surprised by her and her lack of pressure, and also her like supreme confidence that I was going to figure it out. So I've been in those shoes. And I think the big thing for me was I figured out how I worked. And so, we have this picture failure to launch, which is a lot of what I deal with. These are gifted kids who then hit a wall like I did. So had a lot of potential, just never really comes to it. They struggle a lot with things like discipline, motivation. I think oftentimes they will look for some kind of solution, right? Because we as human beings, we don't realize that most of life is multifactorial. That if you do a multivariate regression analysis, you're not going to find that it was the hair loss meds. And so this is where we kind of come back to the roadmap, where I think the most important thing, and I've helped anywhere between hundreds to millions, whether you consider YouTube or not. And the main thing is they don't know how they work. See, men are not taught to understand; they're taught to do. Like we're like, do this thing, like get a job, do this. And women have all kinds of expectations, have babies, and work and do everything exceptionally well. But I think we're just not taught how to understand ourselves. So the biggest thing that I see is not a problem of treatment, but is a problem of misdiagnosis. And one of the things that you learn, I think people don't really realize this, but like most of medicine is not treatment. Like I don't think treatment is usually the hard part. I think the diagnosis is the hard part. Understanding really what's wrong. Just as another example of this, I've worked with so many people, young men, who are like, I'm so tired. How do I increase my energy? How do I increase my energy? And what they don't realize is like if you think about tiredness is a signal from the brain. Tiredness is not always low energy. Tiredness is your brain's way of telling you that this is not worth doing. And the interesting thing is there are a lot of things that we do need to do that we will feel tired for. But the real solution to that is sometimes is to force yourself to do it and kind of get yourself out of it. There are some studies that show that exercise is equally effective to an SSRI. So there's a value to that. But I think what a lot of people are missing is their conception of the thing is what's making them tired. If you think about something that you haven't done before and you're like, oh my God, I have to do this thing. And then when you do it, you're like, oh, it's not that bad. And then you procrastinate on doing the thing, even though it's actually pretty easy to do. So changing your understanding of what you are tired to do is the fastest way to be able to do it. But the problem is we don't teach men what's going on inside them, right? We don't teach them about their emotions. We don't teach them about motivation. And so when I focus on that, that's really what I focus on doing. There's an old Sanskrit sentiment that avidya, which means ignorance, is the source of dukkha, which is suffering. All of your suffering in life has nothing to do with willpower, motivation, or anything like that. It's all a lack of understanding. And the more I've worked, the more I've realized that the most powerful thing that you can give yourself is understanding. Even if I were to ask you, like the things that are easy for you are the things that you understand. And before you understood them, they were hard. As someone who's lazy, like understanding what motivates you is actually more important than discipline or willpower, for me anyway. I'm a degenerate. And I think this is what a lot of these young men who failure to thrive, like I had one patient who, was 31 years old, struggled with addiction, drop out. 2 years later, not only is he finishing therapy school, he's becoming a therapist, so he's supporting himself, making about $150K a year. He's also writing a dystopian novel. 2 years later, he messaged me it had been published, right? And it's like understanding why he behaved the way that he did. And the more that you understand how the system works, then you can make minor adjustments and you can make it work. A car is really hard to move if you're not driving it and you don't know how to turn it on.